The bitter November wind howled a mournful song outside, a sound that seemed to claw its way through the cracked stone walls of the basement. Liam felt the cold, not just on his skin, but deep in his bones, a permanent gnawing ache that had settled in weeks ago. He pulled the thin, threadbare blanket tighter around his 6-year-old daughter, Maya, who shivered even in her sleep. Her small breaths puffed out in faint white clouds, each one a painful reminder of their failure. The air, thick and heavy, smelled of damp earth, centuries of decay, and the faint, metallic scent of utter despair. His stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot, a hunger so profound it felt like it was consuming him from the inside. He felt a familiar lump rise in his throat, the unshed tears of a father who had promised to protect his child and was now failing in the most fundamental way. His calloused hands, once capable of building houses from the ground up, now trembled with a cold that wasn't just from the temperature. They were ghosts, haunting the forgotten cellar of an abandoned mansion, trespassers on the very edge of oblivion. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images came anyway. The sterile white of the hospital room, the incessant rhythmic beeping of machines that had counted down the last moments of his wife's life. He could still smell the antiseptic. A scent forever burned into his memory, a scent that meant loss. That illness, so swift and so cruel, had taken not only the love of his life, but their entire future. It had left behind a mountain of paper, bills, final notices, threats that grew until it buried them. The eviction notice had been the final shovel of dirt on their old life. The landlord's voice, devoid of sympathy, still echoed in his ears. Business is business. They weren't people anymore. They were a liability, a line item to be erased. He felt his heart clench with a grief so sharp it stole his breath. He had lost his wife, then his home, then his dignity. Now, huddled in the freezing darkness, he felt like he was losing himself, piece by painful piece, with nothing left to hold on to but the tiny, shivering girl beside him. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, his fingers closing around the crumpled bills and loose change. He didn't need to count it. The number was seared into his brain, a brand mark of his failure. $47. He could feel the exact shape of the two $20 bills, 1 5, 2 1s Y, and the handful of coins. $47 to stand between his daughter and a world determined to crush them. What was that, really? A few days' worth of cheap food. Not enough for a motel room. Not even for one night. Not enough to buy back their warmth or their safety. A bitter laugh almost escaped his lips. He, Liam, a man who had once earned his living with the strength of his back and the skill of his hands, a man who had framed houses and raised roofs, couldn't even provide a solid or warm wall for his own child. The rough concrete floor beneath him felt like a tombstone, and the $47 felt less like money and more like the last few grains of sand in an hourglass that was about to run out completely. Maya stirred in her sleep, a soft whimper escaping her lips. "Cold, Daddy," she murmured, her voice a fragile whisper in the oppressive silence. Liam's heart shattered into 1,000 icy fragments. He leaned over, his own chattering teeth making it hard to speak, and whispered back, "I know, sweetie, I'm here. I've got you." He tried to rub some warmth into her small arms, but his own hands felt like blocks of ice. Her innocence was the cruelest part of it all. To her, this was a strange, scary camping trip. She didn't understand the finality of the eviction, the cold dread of having nowhere else to go. She just knew it was cold, and she was hungry, and she trusted him to fix it. That trust felt like a physical weight on his chest, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a cold path down his cheek. He was her hero, her protector, and here they were, in a dark, freezing hole, with nothing but a dirty blanket and the clothes on their backs. The darkness of the basement felt absolute, a living thing that threatened to swallow them whole. Through a grimy, ground-level window, Liam could see the first, faint hint of dawn, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray. A new day. For most people, that meant hope, a fresh start. For him, it just meant another 24 hours of failure to survive. The light did not bring warmth, only a clearer view of their grim reality. the cobwebs thick as cotton candy in the corners, the rust stains bleeding down the stone walls, the faint scurrying sounds that hinted they weren't entirely alone. This place, this derelict mansion on the forgotten edge of town, was their last resort. The townspeople whispered stories about it, tales of tragedy and ghosts, a place left to rot. Now, they were part of its decay, two more forgotten souls hiding in its guts. Liam felt a profound emptiness settle over him, a hollow space where hope used to be. He had no plan, no way out. There was only the cold, the hunger, and the sleeping child in his arms. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't a shelter. It was a grave they had walked into willingly. Liam awoke with a gasp, his body a single, unified ache of cold. Every joint screamed in protest as he pushed himself up from the concrete floor. The air was still glacial, a physical presence that hurt to breathe, but something was different. Cutting through the familiar stench of mold and decay was a new scent, one so out of place it felt like a hallucination. It was the smell of warm bread and savory broth. He squeezed his eyes shut and opened them again, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs with a frantic, unsteady rhythm. He thought the hunger and the cold had finally broken his mind, that he was now imagining the very things he craved most. The scent was torture, a phantom promise in a world that had offered him nothing but pain. He felt a tremor run through him, one that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature. It was a tremor of pure, terrified disbelief. He didn't dare to hope, but the smell, so rich and real, was pulling him from his stupor, beckoning him forward into the gloom. He stumbled to his feet, his muscles stiff and unresponsive. The faint grey light from the grimy window was just enough to illuminate the center of the vast, dusty basement. And there, perched impossibly on the splintered, broken table, was a small wooden tray. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a hallucination. On the tray sat a steaming bowl of thick soup, a chunk of dark, fresh bread, and a small, delicate glass filled with milk. Steam rose from the soup in a lazy curl, a warm, living thing in the dead air. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hesitating just above the ceramic bowl. He could feel its heat radiating into his palm. It was real. A wave of vertigo washed over him, a dizzying mix of relief so profound it felt like grief. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, his mind reeling. How? Who? There was no sound, no footprint in the thick dust, no sign of entry. It was a miracle, a terrifying, inexplicable miracle that made no sense at all. Without a second thought, he rushed back to Maya and gently shook her awake. "Maya, sweetie, wake up. Look." Her eyes fluttered open, still clouded with sleep and the dullness of hunger. Then she saw it. A soft gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes, which had been so listless, widened with a light he hadn't seen in weeks. He carried her to the table and watched, his heart a painful knot in his chest, as she wrapped her small, cold hands around the warm bowl. She ate with a quiet intensity, scooping the thick soup into her mouth, her gaze never leaving the food. She drank the milk, leaving a tiny white mustache on her upper lip that almost made him laugh. The sight of his daughter, safe and fed, was so overwhelming that hot tears began to stream down his face, dripping silently onto the dusty floor. For this one moment, this impossible breakfast, the gnawing beast of hunger was gone. In its place, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren landscape of his soul. The next morning, it was there again. The same tray, the same warm meal, waiting for them in the silent gloom. The initial wave of miraculous relief was now replaced by a chilling undercurrent of dread. The night before, Liam had forced himself to stay awake, his body screaming for rest. He sat in the darkness, every nerve-ending tingling, his ears straining to catch the slightest sound, the scrape of a shoe, the groan of a hidden door, a whisper in the dark. He heard nothing. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was as if the food had simply willed itself into existence on the table. He felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. This was no simple act of charity. An anonymous gift left on a church step was one thing. A meal appearing in a sealed, abandoned basement was another entirely. It felt like a message, a demonstration of power from a source he could not see or comprehend. The hope he'd felt was curdling into fear. He spent the entire day in a frantic, meticulous search. He became an investigator in his own prison. He ran his calloused fingertips over every single stone in the walls, pushing and pulling, searching for a loose block, a hidden seam, anything that suggested a hidden passage. He found only solid, unyielding stone coated in a century of grime. He re-examined the main basement door at the top of the concrete steps. The heavy wooden bar he had wedged against it was untouched, thick with cobwebs. The small, ground-level windows were sealed tight, the glass thick with filth, the frames rusted shut years ago. He scoured the floor, his eyes inches from the ground, looking for any disturbance in the thick layer of dust that coated everything. There were only 2 sets of tracks, his own worn boots and Maya's tiny shoes. There was no way in and no way out. A profound sense of violation washed over him. They were in a sealed box, and something was getting in. On the 3rd day, the meal was there, and on the 4th, the impossible became a ritual. They would wake up, their bodies aching from the cold floor, and the offering would be waiting. The gnawing ache of hunger in their stomachs was gone, but it had been replaced by a new, more insidious torment that gnawed at his mind. Liam felt his sanity begin to fray like a worn rope. He was a specimen in a jar, a rat in a cage, being kept alive by a faceless experimenter for some unknown purpose. His heart hammered against his ribs every morning as he forced himself to walk towards the table. The act of retrieving the food was a nauseating cocktail of primal gratitude for the sustenance that kept Maya healthy and a sheer, gut-wrenching terror of the invisible hand that provided it. The basement had changed. It was no longer a simple shelter. It was a stage, and they were the unwilling actors in a play written by a ghost. Maya, in her 6-year-old innocence, was shielded from the true horror of their situation. To her, it was a strange and magical occurrence. She named their unseen benefactor the Food Ghost, and began leaving little gifts in return. A pretty rock she'd found, a small drawing she'd made using a piece of charcoal scraped from a blackened wall. "Maybe it's an angel, Daddy," she whispered one evening, her voice filled with a pure, unwavering faith that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Every innocent word she spoke amplified his own crushing sense of failure and impotence. He was her father, her protector, yet he could not provide for her. He was a passive recipient, a beggar taking handouts from a phantom. This mysterious presence had usurped his role, and he was powerless to stop it. The basement was no longer just a cold, damp space. It had become a cage of dependency. The dread became a constant companion, a third entity sharing the cold, stale air with them. It was a low hum beneath the silence, a feeling of being perpetually watched that crawled over his skin and made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The silence itself felt different now. It was no longer empty but pregnant, charged with an unnerving awareness. Liam would whip his head around at imagined noises, his eyes darting into the deep shadows, expecting to see a figure resolve itself from the darkness. There was never anything there. Just the same damp stone walls, the same thick cobwebs, the same oppressive emptiness. This constant, invisible surveillance was a form of psychological torture, shrinking their world until it consisted of nothing but the small, illuminated circle of their fear. He felt like an insect under a magnifying glass, and the sun was getting hotter. The thought of leaving flashed through his mind, a bolt of pure panic. But it was an impossible impulse. Where would they go? The image of Maya shivering on a frozen street corner, her face blue with cold, her stomach empty, was enough to suffocate the thought before it could fully form. He looked at his daughter, curled up asleep under the thin blanket. For the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, with a full belly. Her cheeks were even regaining a touch of their healthy, rosy color. Leaving meant trading this unnerving psychological horror for the absolute certainty of exposure, starvation, and sickness. He was caught in an elegant, brutal trap. The choice was between a slow, creeping madness inside these walls, or a swift, merciless death outside of them. A wave of nausea surged from his stomach to his throat. The false hope of that first meal had been a bait, and the door of the cage had just slammed shut behind them. The food itself became a symbol of his total and utter failure. Every morning, the sight of the warm bread and steaming soup made his stomach clench, not with hunger, but with a deep, burning shame. He was a man reduced to scavenging, accepting mysterious charity from an entity he couldn't see or thank or fight. He felt stripped of his identity, his purpose. His hands, which had once built homes with confidence and skill, now trembled as he picked up the tray. This feeling of dependency was a slow-acting poison, a more profound and corrosive hunger that fed on his spirit. It ate away at his sense of self-worth, making him question his value as a father, as a man. He had promised to protect his daughter from the world, and instead, he had led her into a place where they were nothing more than pets, fed and observed by an unseen master. The basement was a tomb, and he felt his own spirit being buried alive. Every sound in the vast, echoing basement became amplified and sinister. The steady, rhythmic drip of water from a rusted pipe was no longer just a leak. It was the ticking of a clock, counting down to some unknown event. The frantic scrabbling of unseen creatures in the walls wasn't just vermin. It was the movement of spies, the agents of their silent warden, reporting on their every move. Liam's senses were stretched to their breaking point, a constant state of high alert that was utterly exhausting. He would flinch at the drop of a pebble, his heart rocketing into his throat. Sleep offered no respite. His dreams were haunted by dark, faceless figures standing in the corners of the room, their silence more menacing than any threat. He would wake up with a gasp, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the feeling of being watched clinging to him like a shroud. A new and even more terrifying thought began to take root in his mind, a cold, sharp splinter of fear. What if the food suddenly stopped? What if their silent benefactor decided their game was over? The fear was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. They were completely, utterly, at the mercy of this unknown power. Their bodies had grown accustomed to the daily nourishment. To have it suddenly and inexplicably withdrawn would be a new kind of cruelty, a psychological torment far worse than the simple, honest hunger they had known before. The initial hope that first meal had provided had now soured completely, transforming into a constant, low-level thrum of anxiety. They were living on a knife's edge, and Liam was terrified of the moment the blade would finally turn. The miracle had become a threat, the hope a weapon pointed directly at them. He felt his grip on reality slipping. A creeping paranoia began to color his thoughts, bordering on madness. He found himself staring at the stone walls for hours on end, convinced he could see them subtly shifting, breathing. He would press his ear against the cold, damp rock, straining to hear something, anything, beyond the frantic thumping of his own heart in his ears. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on him, crushing his spirit. In the basement, time had lost all meaning. There was no day or night, only the dim, unchanging grey light from the filthy ground-level window and the long, terrifying stretches of absolute darkness. Their existence was marked only by the appearance of the morning meal, a single, horrifying point of reference in an endless sea of cold, dark and silent dread. Liam felt like he was drowning, but the water was made of time itself. The breaking point arrived quietly, without drama or violence, on the 5th morning. As Maya sat at the table, carefully sipping her soup, she paused and looked up at him. Her brow was furrowed with a child's simple, honest concern. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice a small, clear bell in the oppressive silence. "Why are you crying?" He hadn't even been aware of it. He raised a hand to his face and felt the hot, wet tracks of tears on his cold skin. He was weeping silently, the tears a hot mixture of impotent rage, abject fear, and profound humiliation. He looked at his daughter, her innocent face illuminated by the bleak morning light, and he saw not just his child, but the full extent of their entrapment. In that instant, something inside him snapped. The fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else, a desperate, clawing determination to find answers. He would not let them live like this. The false hope had finally burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, hard ash of their terrifying new reality. They weren't rescued, they were captured. The basement, which had once seemed like a desperate last resort, was now revealed to be a far more personal and sinister prison than the cold, indifferent world outside. The sheer anonymity of their captor was the most torturous part. There was no one to reason with, no one to fight, no one to even hate. There was only the food, the silence, and the suffocating, absolute certainty of being watched. Liam stared into the deepest shadows of the cellar, the last embers of his hope finally extinguished. In their place, a cold, hard resolve began to form. He had hit the very bottom. Now, there was nothing left to do but find a way to climb out or be swallowed by this darkness forever. That afternoon, the bleak resignation that had been poisoning Liam's soul was replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath his skin, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. He would not be a passive victim in this psychological cage. He felt a surge of his old self return, the builder, the problem solver. A house was a system of hidden spaces, supports, and passages, and this derelict mansion was no different. His eyes, now sharp and analytical, swept over the vast damp basement, not as a prisoner surveying his cell, but as a demolitions expert looking for the one structural weakness that would bring the whole illusion crashing down. He began a new kind of search, not for an exit, but for a truth. He ran his hands over the cold stones, no longer just feeling for loose ones, but listening, tapping gently, sensing the vibrations through his fingertips. He felt the shift in his own spirit. The prey was beginning to think like a hunter. He had to understand the how behind the food, the who behind the silence. While Liam was consumed by his methodical investigation, Maya, now accustomed to their strange new life, had created her own small world in the corner of the basement. The constant, gnawing hunger was gone, and with it, some of the fear that had dulled her spirit. She was playing a quiet game with a collection of small, smooth stones, humming a soft tune that barely disturbed the heavy silence. The tune was a fragile, beautiful thing in the oppressive gloom, a testament to a child's resilience. She was near the far wall, a section where the dampness was most pronounced, and the stone face was stained a dark, ugly green with patches of black mold. To Liam, it was a symbol of decay. To Maya, it was just another part of her new, strange playground. She ran her tiny fingers over the rough, gritty surface, tracing the lines of mortar between the massive, uneven blocks of granite. Entirely lost in her own innocent world, oblivious to the desperate hunt her father was conducting just a few feet away. This was their new normal, a father's quiet desperation and a child's quiet play. Her humming stopped abruptly. A different sound replaced it, a faint, scraping noise, followed by a small clatter. "Daddy!" she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Look what I found!" Liam, who had been examining a rusted drain pipe on the opposite side of the room, turned, his heart giving a familiar, nervous jolt. He walked over, his boots crunching softly on the gritty floor. Maya was holding something up for him in her palm. It wasn't one of her grey stones. It was a small object, dark with age and grime, but with a definite, deliberate shape. "It was hiding," she said, pointing to a small crevice in the wall at her eye level, a spot where the thick mortar between two large stones had crumbled away, leaving a dark, narrow gap. She had been picking at the loose, sandy material, as a child might, and her small fingers had found something solid tucked deep inside the wall. Liam felt a strange premonition, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. This was different. This wasn't a rock. This felt like a beginning. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking in protest on the cold concrete. "Let me see, sweetie," he said, his voice a low whisper. She placed the object in his calloused hand. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings slightly outstretched as if in mid-flight. The wood was dark, almost petrified, and incredibly light. Despite the simple, almost childlike carving, there was an undeniable artistry to it, a sense of captured motion. A cold wave washed over him. This wasn't something that belonged here, not naturally. It hadn't fallen or been dropped by accident. It had been placed, hidden deliberately inside the very structure of the building. His heart began to beat a little faster, a staccato rhythm against his ribs. He turned the tiny bird over and over in his fingers, feeling its smooth, worn surfaces. It felt ancient, a silent witness to something long forgotten. This small, insignificant-seeming piece of wood felt like the first real clue, the first thread he could pull in this suffocating web of mystery. His gaze snapped from the bird to the hole in the wall. A new electric energy coursed through him, a mixture of intense fear and exhilarating hope. He gave the bird back to Maya. "Hold this for me, sweetie. Don't lose it." He then turned his full attention to the crevice. He pressed his fingers into the gap, feeling the crumbling, sandy texture of the old mortar. It disintegrated into dust under the pressure. The air that seeped out of the hole was different, colder and carrying a faint, musty smell, like air that had been trapped for 100 years. He hooked his fingers deeper into the opening, his knuckles scraping against the rough stone. He could feel the edge of the large granite block. He pulled. It didn't budge, but the mortar around it continued to fall away, revealing a wider and wider seam. A thought, wild and improbable, took root in his mind. This wasn't just a weak spot. This was a seam. This was intentional. He could feel it in his gut, a primal instinct telling him he was on the verge of a discovery. He needed leverage. He looked around the dimly lit basement, his eyes scanning for anything he could use as a tool. He spotted a length of rusted rebar half buried in the dirt in a far corner, probably left over from some long-forgotten construction. He retrieved it, the cold, rough metal feeling solid and purposeful in his hands. Returning to the wall, he wedged the flattened tip of the rebar into the seam above the stone block. He put his shoulder into it and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. The stone held firm, a silent guardian of whatever lay behind it. He grunted with effort, his muscles straining, the sound of his own heavy breathing filling the air. Then, with a low, groaning scrape of stone against stone, the block shifted. A shower of dust and mortar rained down onto the floor. Liam felt a jolt of adrenaline so powerful it made his vision swim. He repositioned the bar and pushed again, harder this time, putting all of his weight, all of his desperation, into the effort. It was working. With a final, agonizing groan, the heavy granite block tilted forward and fell with a deafening thud onto the concrete floor, the impact echoing through the basement like a gunshot. The sound made Maya jump, but Liam barely noticed. He was staring, breathless, into the darkness that had been revealed. The block hadn't just been part of the wall, it had been a plug. Behind it was a perfectly square, black opening. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over his face, an ancient breath released from its stone tomb. The smell was overpowering, the scent of deep, undisturbed dust, of decay, and something else, something metallic and cold. His heart was hammering in his chest, a frantic drumbeat of terror and triumph. This was it. This was the way in, the source of the food, the home of the ghost. He knew, with an absolute and chilling certainty, that he had just breached the heart of the mansion's secret, and there was no turning back now from what he would find within. He reached a trembling hand into the dark opening, his fingers brushing against something flat, cold and metallic. It was a door. He swept away the thick cobwebs and grime, his fingers tracing the outline. It was small, maybe 2 feet square, and made of heavy iron, with a small recessed handle, but no visible lock. A profound sense of unreality settled over him. The stone he had removed was just a facade, a cleverly designed camouflage to hide this entrance from the world. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal this. The metal was cold as ice against his skin, a stark contrast to the rough, earthy texture of the surrounding stone. An involuntary shiver ran down his spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was touching the mechanism of their imprisonment, the physical manifestation of the mystery that had been tormenting him. It was a door not just into another space, but into another time, into a secret kept for generations. A new question screamed in his mind. What was so important that it needed to be hidden behind a false wall? He recognized it immediately from old buildings he'd worked on. A dumbwaiter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The food, the tray. It wasn't a ghost. It was this hidden shaft was the delivery system. The invisible warden wasn't a phantom. It was a person. Someone with access to another part of this house. Someone who knew about this secret passage and was using it to deliver the meals that had kept them alive. The miracle was just mechanics, and the mystery was just architecture. But this rational explanation did nothing to soothe his fear. In fact, it amplified it. A ghost was an unknowable horror, but a person had motives. A person could be cruel, calculating. A person could decide to stop or decide to do worse. The knowledge that a living, breathing human was aware of their presence, was watching them, feeding them like caged animals, was infinitely more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. He felt his stomach clench with a new kind of dread. They weren't just being observed, they were being managed. He gripped the recessed handle and pulled. The door was frozen shut, sealed tight by decades of rust and disuse. It didn't budge an inch. The groaning protest it made was barely a whisper, a sound of metal fused to metal. Liam's frustration mounted, a hot, angry wave. He was so close. The answer was right here, inches away, behind this stubborn slab of iron. He grabbed the rebar again. This time, he wasn't trying to be quiet. He wedged the tip into the seam of the dumbwaiter door and threw his entire body into it. The clang of metal against metal was deafening in the silence, a series of sharp, violent reports that echoed off the stone walls. Sparks flew, rust flakes showered the floor. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, sweat beading on his forehead and stinging his eyes. He was no longer just a father trying to survive. He was an archaeologist breaking into a tomb, a prisoner tearing down his own cell wall. Every strike of the rebar was a blow against his own fear, his own powerlessness. He would not be stopped. Not now. With a final, ear-splitting shriek of protesting metal, the lock or seal, whatever had held it fast for so long, broke. The door flew open with a violent clang, swinging inward into the darkness. It slammed against the inside of the shaft with a resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the basement. Liam stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands aching from the effort. He stared into the opening. He had expected to see a dark, vertical shaft leading up, the typical path of a dumbwaiter. But he saw something else entirely. It was not a shaft. It was a tunnel, a narrow, horizontal service tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, leading straight back into the foundations of the house. It was constructed of rough brick and disappeared into an impenetrable darkness beyond the reach of the basement's dim light. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a simple lift for food. This was a passageway, a secret road built into the bones of the mansion. A new loop in the mystery opened, more terrifying than the last. The food didn't come down from above. It came from somewhere else within the house, through this hidden corridor. 100 questions assaulted him at once. Where did it lead? Who built it? And why? He felt a powerful, magnetic pull towards the darkness, an undeniable need to see where it ended. But the thought of leaving Maya alone, even for a few minutes, filled him with a cold, primal fear. He looked back at her. She was standing a few feet away, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, clutching the small wooden bird to her chest like a talisman. She was watching him, her complete and utter faith in him shining in her gaze. He had to go. This tunnel held the answers, and the answers were the only thing that could lead to their freedom. The risk of the unknown was finally less terrifying than the certainty of their current situation. He had to know who was on the other end of this passage. He had to face their captor. He took a deep, steadying breath, the stale, dusty air filling his lungs. "Maya," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "I need you to be a very brave girl for me. I'm going to look inside this tunnel. I won't be long. I need you to stand right here by the opening and wait for me. Don't move, and don't be scared. Okay?" She nodded, her small face pale but resolute in the gloom. Her trust in him was a physical weight, a responsibility that both crushed him and gave him strength. He squeezed her shoulder, a last moment of contact, then turned back to the dark, gaping maw in the wall. He felt a profound sense of dread, the feeling of a man stepping off a cliff into a dark, unknown sea. He was about to crawl into the literal guts of the monster that held them captive, His every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to stay with his daughter, but a deeper conviction pushed him forward. He couldn't protect her by hiding. He could only protect her by uncovering the truth, no matter how monstrous it might be. Getting into the tunnel was a struggle. He had to turn sideways and shuffle in, his shoulders scraping against the rough, cold brick on either side. The air inside was thick and suffocating, completely devoid of any light. Once he was clear of the opening, the basement's dim grey light was swallowed, and he was plunged into an absolute, disorienting blackness. The silence was even more profound here, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of his own heart, which sounded deafeningly loud in the confined space. A wave of claustrophobia washed over him, a primal panic that made his muscles seize. He fought it down, forcing himself to take one slow, shuffling step after another. His outstretched hands brushed against the walls, feeling the gritty texture of the brick and the delicate, sticky strands of ancient cobwebs that broke against his skin. He felt like he was moving through a throat, being swallowed by the house itself. The darkness was a physical presence, pressing in on him from all sides. He shuffled forward, his hands outstretched in front of him, his boots scuffing on the uneven floor. The tunnel was longer than he expected. It felt like he was traveling for an eternity through the cold, dead heart of the earth. He tried to count his steps, but lost track almost immediately, his mind consumed by the sensory deprivation and the growing tension. What was he walking toward? A person, an empty room, a trap. Every shuffling step was a gamble. He could feel the tunnel begin to curve slightly to the right. The air grew even more stale, heavy with the scent of dry rot and something else, something faintly sweet and unpleasant, like old, dried flowers. The silence was so absolute that he began to hear things. A faint whisper that was just the blood rushing in his ears. A distant footstep that was only the echo of his own. His imagination began to paint horrific images in the blackness, and he had to clench his jaw to keep from crying out. He was completely vulnerable, a blind man walking into the unknown. After what felt like a lifetime, his outstretched fingers brushed against something that wasn't brick. It was wood. He felt around, his heart leaping into his throat. It was another door, a simple, flat, plank door. He fumbled in the darkness, and his hand closed around a small, cold, metal latch. There was no lock. With a trembling hand, he lifted the latch. The mechanism moved with surprising ease, the soft click echoing loudly in the narrow space. He pushed. The door swung inward without a sound, opening into another space. A sliver of faint light cut through the blackness, originating from a tiny, filth-encrusted grate high up on the far wall. It wasn't much, but after the absolute black of the tunnel, it felt as bright as a spotlight. He stepped through the doorway, his eyes struggling to adjust. He was in a room, a small, sealed-off chamber no larger than a walk-in closet. The air here was heavy, stagnant, and thick with the dust of ages. It was a forgotten place, a secret room, a tomb. The faint light was just enough to illuminate the scene before him, a tableau frozen in time. In the center of the small room stood a small, elegant writing desk, its surface coated in a thick, grey blanket of dust that had softened all its edges. A simple wooden chair was tucked neatly beneath it, as if its occupant had just stood up and intended to return at any moment. The silence in the room was different from the silence of the basement. This was a heavy, mournful silence, the silence of abandonment and long-forgotten sorrow. Liam felt like an intruder, a profaner of some sacred, hidden space. His breath hitched in his chest. He could feel the history in the air, the weight of the years that had passed since anyone had last stood in this spot. He took a hesitant step forward, the sound of his boot on the floorboards shockingly loud. This was the source. This was the control room for the mystery that had governed their lives. And it was empty. The ghost, it seemed, was long gone. He approached the desk, his movements slow and reverent. The dust was so thick, it was like a layer of fine, grey snow. It had preserved everything beneath it perfectly. He could see the faint outlines of objects on the desk's surface. With a hesitant finger, he wiped away a patch of dust. The rich, dark brown of polished wood was revealed beneath. His eyes were drawn to two objects lying in the center of the desk. One was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover dark and unadorned. A diary. The other was a small stack of papers, folded and tied with a faded ribbon. They looked official, the paper thick and yellowed with age. He could just make out the formal, printed letterhead at the top of the first page. Property deeds. A chill, completely unrelated to the cold, traced its way down his spine. This wasn't just a hidden room. This was an office, a secret archive, a place where someone had hidden not just themselves, but their story and their secrets. He felt the weight of the discovery settle on him. He reached out and touched the leather diary. The cover was cool and surprisingly supple beneath the layer of dust. The smell of old leather and dry, brittle paper rose to meet him, a scent that spoke of secrets and time. His fingers trembled slightly as he ran them over the smooth cover. Inside this book was a voice, a story, the answer to the why. Why this room existed, why the dumbwaiter was built, why it was all hidden behind a wall of stone. He felt an overwhelming urge to open it, to let the silent voice speak after so many years of confinement. But his eyes were drawn to the stack of deeds next to it. The formal, legalistic text visible through the dust promised a different kind of story, one of land and ownership, of power and money. The two objects sat side by side, a personal history and a financial one. Liam had a sudden, gut-wrenching feeling that the two were deeply, tragically intertwined. He was standing at the epicenter of a long-buried crime, and he was holding the evidence in his hands. His gaze swept across the rest of the desk and then to the floor beside it. Tucked away in the shadows, almost completely obscured by the thick dust, was a third object, a box. It was a small strong box, made of heavy, black iron, bound with two thick straps of the same material. It was old, clearly from a different era, and it radiated an aura of importance. A heavy, ornate lock, green with verdigris, secured the front. His heart began to pound a new, frantic rhythm, a diary, deeds, and a locked iron box. This was a classic triad of buried secrets. This was where the story took a new turn. The why was likely in the diary, but the what, the tangible, physical secret, was almost certainly locked inside this box. The mystery of the food was solved, but it had been replaced by a new, far more compelling question. What was in the strongbox? He knelt down, his hand hovering over the cold, dusty metal. It felt heavy, impossibly so, as if weighted down by more than just its physical contents. He had to know. The rebar was still in his hand, a crude but effective key. He wedged the tip into the small gap between the lid and the body of the strongbox, right next to the rusted lock. He took a deep breath, the dust tickling his throat, and put all his strength into it. The metal of the box was thick, far stronger than the dumbwaiter door had been. For a moment, nothing happened. The rebar just scraped uselessly against the iron. He repositioned it, finding a better angle, and tried again, grunting with the strain. This time, the lid creaked in protest. He leveraged the bar back and forth, the screeching of tortured metal filling the small, silent room. It was a sound of violation, of a long-kept secret being forcibly exhumed. Sweat dripped from his brow onto the dusty lid, creating small, dark circles. He was breaking and entering a life, a history, and he could feel the transgression in his bones, but he couldn't stop. He was driven by a force more powerful than curiosity, the desperate hope for a weapon, for leverage, for a way out. With a final, sharp crack that echoed like a breaking bone, the rusted hasp of the lock snapped. The tension released so suddenly that Liam stumbled backward, the rebar clattering to the floor. Silence rushed back into the room, heavier than before. For a long moment, he just stared at the box, his chest heaving. The lid was slightly ajar, a dark line in the dusty surface. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, his heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of his chest. He reached out with a hand that shook so badly he could barely control it. He hooked his fingers under the edge of the heavy iron lid. It felt like he was opening a coffin. He lifted. The lid creaked open on its ancient hinges, revealing the contents within. Liam gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. The air that escaped from the box smelled of dust, old paper, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay. But it was what he saw, that made his blood run cold and his mind go completely blank. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Jewelry, maybe, more documents, something small and personal. He had not expected this. The box was filled to the brim with money, stacks and stacks of it, bundled neatly with paper bands that had yellowed and grown brittle with age. But it wasn't modern currency. These were old bills, larger than modern notes, with unfamiliar faces and designs. He picked up one of the bundles. The paper was crisp, almost perfectly preserved in the dry, sealed environment. He read the denomination, $100. He thumbed through the stack. There were at least 50 bills in that one bundle alone, and the box was full of them. He stared at the face of Benjamin Franklin, a man from a history book printed on currency from the 1970s. It was a fortune, a life-changing, impossible fortune, sitting in a dusty box in a secret room. A wave of dizziness washed over him. The sheer, shocking reality of it was too much to comprehend. This wasn't just a secret, it was a treasure. He sank back on his heels, the bundle of cash feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. The basement, the cold, the hunger, the fear, it all seemed to recede, replaced by the stunning reality of the money in his lap. This was a way out. This was more than a way out. It was a new life. But as the initial shock began to fade, a deeper, colder understanding began to set in. Money like this wasn't just forgotten. It was hidden. It was dirty. This fortune was inextricably linked to the diary and the deeds on the desk, linked to this secret room and the person who had been confined here. This wasn't a lottery win, it was evidence. He looked from the cash in his hands to the silent, leather-bound diary on the desk. The mystery was not solved. He had just peeled back the first layer of a much older, much darker story. The how was the dumbwaiter. The what was the money. But the why was still a ghost, trapped between the pages of the book, waiting to be released. And Liam knew, with chilling certainty, that the story it told would be the most dangerous discovery of all. With the impossible fortune and the silent diary clutched in his hands, Liam shuffled back through the suffocating blackness of the tunnel. Each step was a battle, his mind reeling from the discovery. The air in the main basement felt different now, charged with the energy of the secret he had unearthed. He looked over at Maya, a small, still lump under the grey blanket, and a wave of terror washed over him. This knowledge, this money, it wasn't a blessing, it was a curse. He carefully hid the heavy strongbox and the brittle deeds back inside the hidden chamber, resealing it with the heavy stone block as best he could. He kept only the diary, its worn leather cover feeling both cold and hot against his skin like a feverish secret. He sat on the floor, the book in his lap, the weight of a life and a crime pressing down on him. The silence of the basement was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghostly presence of a woman named Isabella, and he knew he could not rest until he heard her story. He waited until Maya's breathing was deep and even, a soft rhythm in the oppressive quiet. Then, by the faint, ghostly light from the grimy window, he opened the book. A faint, musty scent of dried paper and forgotten perfume rose from the pages. The first page was filled with an elegant, looping script, the ink a faded sepia brown. It was the writing of a young woman full of life. He felt a profound sense of trespassing, of reading something not meant for him, but he couldn't stop. His heart ached with a strange, preemptive sorrow. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1973. "My secret joy grows within me," it began. "A life made of pure love. Father must never know. His reputation is everything, and he would see this not as a miracle, but as a stain to be scrubbed away. I can feel his cold eyes on me, even when he is not here. I am so afraid, but the thought of my child's face gives me the strength of a lioness." Liam felt a lump form in his throat. He was reading a prelude to a tragedy. His fingers, rough and calloused, trembled as he turned the brittle pages. The story unfolded, a slow descent from secret joy into palpable fear. Isabella wrote of her love for a young man her father disapproved of, a man with no wealth or status. She wrote of stolen moments and whispered promises. Then the diary's tone shifted. The graceful handwriting grew tighter, more angular, as if carved into the page by a hand shaking with terror. "He knows," one entry read. the words nearly illegible. He found one of my letters. His face. It was not anger. It was something colder. The face of a businessman calculating a loss. He did not yell. He simply said, "This disgrace will be dealt with." Liam felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He could almost hear the man's voice, devoid of emotion, a voice that prized profit and power over the life of his own daughter. He was reading the origin of the ghost that haunted this cold, dark place. The next entry was a scream of ink on paper, the page stained with what could only be tears. "He has locked me away, in the cellar, like an animal." Liam's breath caught in his chest, his eyes darting around the very room he was sitting in. He was in her cage. Isabella described how her father, Magnus Correa, had dragged her down the stairs, his grip like iron on her arm. She wrote of the heavy bar being slammed across the door, the sound of her world being sealed shut. "He told me I would stay here until I had paid for my sin, until the shame I had brought upon the family name was contained. He called my child a bastard and a complication. My heart has shattered into a million pieces. The cold is a living thing down here. It is crawling into my soul." Liam felt a surge of nausea. The cold he had been fighting for days was the same cold that had consumed her. He was not just in her prison. He was feeling its echo. He read on, his horror growing with every turned page. Isabella detailed the following weeks with a chilling clarity. The dumbwaiter, a novelty from the house's original construction, became her lifeline and her torment. Twice a day, a small tray of food would appear. A silent, mechanical transaction that stripped her of all humanity. "I am a pet," she wrote, her despair a palpable thing on the page. "Fed by an unseen hand. I hear the distant sounds of the house above me, music, laughter, life going on without me. I scream until my throat is raw, but the stone swallows my voice. No one is coming for me. I am already a ghost." Liam had to close his eyes, the words burning into his mind. He finally understood the food, the silence, the feeling of being watched. It was a system perfected 50 years ago, a mechanism of imprisonment he and Maya had stumbled into. The food ghost was not an angel, it was a jailer. Then the diary revealed a secret far darker than Isabella's personal tragedy. Confined to the silence, her ears became sharp. She learned to listen to the sounds that traveled through the vents and pipes. She wrote of overhearing her father in his study, a room directly above a section of the basement, his voice booming with triumphant cruelty. Magnus Correa was not just a ruthless father, he was a master criminal. Isabella meticulously documented the names of local farming families, people she had known her whole life, as her father boasted about how he had forced them from their ancestral lands. He used a combination of predatory loans, forged documents, and outright threats of violence. He calls it progress, she wrote. He is building an empire, and the foundations are the bones of his neighbors. He laughs about their tears. He says the land remembers. But the law forgets. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. The property deeds he had seen in the hidden room, they were the original, legitimate deeds of the families Magnus had ruined. And the money. Liam's stomach twisted. "He brought a box down here today," a later entry read. "A heavy iron box. He thinks no one can ever find it here." He laughed as he locked it. "The first fruits of our new dynasty," he called it. "The untraceable cash from his first conquests. He hides his seed money in my tomb." Liam felt sick. The fortune he had held in his hands, the money that had promised a new life, was the literal root of all this evil. It was blood money, stained with the suffering of an entire community. Hidden alongside the daughter Magnus was sacrificing for the sake of his clean reputation. The weight of the diary in his lap felt immense, as if it contained the mass of all those stolen lives. The final pages were a descent into delirium and sorrow. The ink grew faint, the handwriting a weak, spidery scrawl. Isabella wrote of her fading health, of the relentless cold, of the child growing inside her, even as she herself wasted away. "I will not survive this," she wrote, "but my baby must. Perhaps there is a shred of humanity left in him. Perhaps he will let my child live." Her last coherent entry was a mother's desperate prayer for a child she would never know. She never mentioned the birth itself or what became of the baby. The story simply stopped. The last page contained only a single, shaky word, written with what must have been the last of her strength: forgive. After that, only empty, silent pages. Liam gently closed the book, his whole body trembling. Isabella hadn't just been imprisoned here. She had died here. The heavy, sorrowful silence of the basement finally had a name. A sharp, scraping sound from above shattered the stillness. Liam's head snapped up, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. This wasn't a familiar noise. It was the loud, deliberate sound of the heavy wooden bar he'd propped against the main basement door being lifted and dragged from the other side. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. Someone was coming. Someone who had a key to the outer lock. He scrambled to his feet, shoving the diary under the thin blanket where Maya slept, his movements clumsy with adrenaline. He moved to stand between his sleeping daughter and the staircase, his body a frail and useless shield. A sliver of light appeared as the heavy door began to groan open, spilling a parallelogram of warm, yellow light down the damp concrete steps. His every muscle tensed. The ghost of the past was about to be replaced by a threat in the present. The door swung fully open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the light. The man was tall, his frame filling the doorway, an imposing shadow of authority. He paused for a moment at the top of the stairs, as if surveying his domain before beginning his descent. His steps were slow, measured, and unnervingly confident. The soft, expensive sound of leather soles on concrete echoed in the vast, silent chamber. This was not a vagrant or an explorer. This was a man who belonged here. Liam's mouth went dry, a metallic taste of fear on his tongue. He watched the man descend, his face obscured by the shadows, his presence radiating a palpable aura of power and menace. Liam instinctively clenched his fists, his body bracing for a confrontation he knew he could not win. The long-forgotten story he had just read was suddenly, terrifyingly, not over. As the man stepped off the final stair and into the basement's gloomy light, Liam felt a jolt of shock. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored business suit and polished black shoes, a stark and surreal contrast to the filth and decay surrounding them. His face was sharp and handsome, with a clean-shaven jaw and perfectly styled dark hair, but his eyes were cold, flat, and utterly devoid of emotion. They were the eyes of a shark. He offered a thin, disarming smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I do apologize for the accommodations," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that seemed to mock the wretchedness of the room. "They are, shall we say, rather rustic. I am Alistair Correa." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Correa. Magnus's bloodline. The heir to the empire, built on bones. The jailer had returned. Alistair's cold eyes scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the empty food tray, then flicking to the area of the wall where Liam had moved the stone. His smile tightened. "You have been more inquisitive than my usual guests," he said. The word guests, a clear insult. "I've been leaving the food, of course, a simple act of compassion to discourage squatters from exploring. It's usually quite effective." He took another step forward, his gaze locking with Liam's. "But you found the loose mortar. I saw you on the camera I maintain in the service tunnel. A wise precaution, you understand. You found my great-aunt's little sanctuary." Liam's stomach plummeted into an icy void. He hadn't just been watched by a ghost. He'd been under live surveillance by the monster's grandson. Every move, every discovery had been observed. Correa stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Liam could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne, a smell of wealth and power that was an obscenity in this place. "You found some personal family effects," he continued, his voice calm and reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "A diary from a deeply troubled relative, some old, meaningless financial papers. They are of sentimental value to my family, you see. A sad chapter we wish to keep private." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a thick, crisp white envelope. "I am prepared to offer you $5,000 for the items and for your discretion. A clean slate, enough for you and your daughter to find a proper apartment and start over, far away from here." The offer was a joke, a calculated dismissal of the horror and the fortune Liam had uncovered. Liam stood frozen. the man's words echoing in the cold air. $5,000. A pittance to bury a murder, a lifetime of agony, and the theft of an entire valley. The sheer audacity of it ignited a hot spark of rage in his chest, a rage that momentarily eclipsed his fear. Alistair saw the flicker of defiance in his eyes, and the thin veneer of civility vanished. The smile disappeared, and his face became a cold, hard mask of ruthless power. His gaze deliberately shifted from Liam to the small, sleeping form of Maya under the blanket. "It is a very generous offer, considering your circumstances," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper that was far more terrifying than any shout. "This is a dangerous old place. Unstable. It would be a terrible tragedy if there were some kind of accident. A little girl could get hurt. So easily." The threat, unspoken but crystal clear, hung in the air between them, colder and sharper than any winter wind. Alistair wasn't just offering to buy his silence, he was threatening to create it. The diary and the deeds were no longer just evidence of a historical crime. They were a death sentence for him and his daughter. Liam was trapped, cornered by a man who had inherited not only his grandfather's wealth, but also his complete lack of a soul. To accept the money was to become a final accomplice in Isabella's tragedy, to let her story die forever in exchange for his own life. To refuse was to declare war on a man who could crush him without a second thought, a man who had just made it clear that Maya was a pawn in his game. The weight of the decision was crushing, a choice between a tainted life and a righteous death. What would you do in his place? Would you take the money and run to save your child? Or would you risk everything to fight for a justice that has been buried for 50 years? The coldness of Alistair Correa's threat was a physical thing, a shard of ice that lodged itself deep in Liam's chest. For a single, eternal second, the world seemed to stop. The damp, musty air, the oppressive silence, the faint rustle of Maya turning in her sleep. It all faded away. All that existed was the image of his daughter, her innocent face so peaceful, and the voice of the monster who had just put a price on her life. The $5,000 felt like an insult, not just to Isabella's memory, but to his own soul, to his very essence as a father. A slow, hot rage began to burn through the ice of his fear. It started in the pit of his stomach, a molten core of pure, protective fury, and spread through his veins like wildfire. He looked from Maya's sleeping form back to Alistair's perfectly composed, handsome face, and he saw not a man, but the embodiment of a generational evil, a smiling predator who had inherited his grandfather's cruelty along with his fortune. In that moment, the choice ceased to be a choice. Surrender was not an option. "No," Liam said. The word was quiet, hoarse, but it seemed to shake the very stones of the basement. It was a sound scraped from the depths of his soul, imbued with all the grief, fear, and now, a granite-hard resolve that had taken root within him. "No." Alistair's thin smile did not falter, but something in his eyes shifted. The cold, flat emptiness was replaced by a flicker of something ancient and ugly, annoyance. The annoyance of a king whose decree has been ignored by a peasant. He gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of weary disappointment, as if Liam were a faulty piece of equipment that now had to be disposed of. "A pity," Alistair said, his voice losing its fabricated warmth and becoming as cold and hard as polished steel. "I truly had hoped you would be reasonable. It's always so messy when people are not." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet finality in his tone was more terrifying than any shout. He gave one last, lingering look at Maya, a look that conveyed a chilling promise of what was to come, then turned without another word. Alistair ascended the concrete steps with the same unhurried, confident pace as before. His polished shoes made soft, rhythmic sounds that echoed in the cavernous space, a countdown to doom. When he reached the top, he pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The rectangle of warm yellow light shrank to a sliver and then vanished, plunging the basement back into its familiar, oppressive gloom. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came a sound that made Liam's blood turn to ice. It was a heavy, grating scrape of metal on metal, followed by the loud, definitive thunk of a heavy exterior bolt being thrown. They were locked in, but it wasn't over. Another sound followed, a low, mechanical groan from somewhere deep within the walls, the sound of ancient machinery being brought to life. It culminated in a deep, resonant clank that seemed to vibrate through the floor, and then a sudden, profound change in the atmosphere. The faint, almost imperceptible draft from the old ventilation grates near the ceiling ceased. The air became utterly, unnaturally still. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of an abandoned place. It was the silence of a sealed tomb. The air immediately felt heavier, thicker, as if it had gained physical weight. Liam stood frozen in the center of the room, every muscle in his body screaming, his mind struggling to catch up with the terrifying reality of what had just happened. Alistair hadn't just locked them in. He had cut off their air. He was going to let them suffocate, let them slowly, agonizingly fade into nothing in the same darkness that had consumed Isabella. It was a murder, designed to be neat, quiet, and leave no evidence. Just 2 more bodies to be found years later. 2 more unfortunate squatters who had met a tragic end in a derelict old house. Maya stirred, woken by the sudden, profound stillness. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's quiet." Liam's heart shattered. He had to be strong for her. But a wave of pure, animalistic panic was rising in his throat, threatening to drown him. He forced himself to move, his limbs feeling heavy and disconnected. "It's okay, sweetie," he lied, his voice a strained whisper. "We're just playing a new game, a quiet game." He knelt beside her, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The air already had a stale, metallic taste to it. He could feel it, the lack of movement, the slow depletion of life. He imagined Isabella, 50 years ago, feeling this same crushing stillness, this same creeping horror, as the air grew thin and her hope died. The thought sent a jolt of desperate energy through him. He would not let his daughter suffer the same fate. He would not let this place claim another generation. His panic, raw and overwhelming, began to sharpen into a desperate, razor-edged focus. Alistair thought he had sealed them in a tomb, but Alistair didn't know the tomb's secrets as well as Liam now did. He had the key. The key was the diary. His mind raced, flipping through the remembered pages of Isabella's elegant, tragic script. He saw her words burned into the darkness behind his eyes, a ghostly blueprint of his own prison. He had been so focused on her emotional torment, on the story of her imprisonment, that he had skimmed over other details about the house itself. She had written about the sounds, the layout, the veins and arteries of the old mansion. She wrote about the service tunnels, not just the one he had found, but a network of them. "And this house is a honeycomb," one passage had read, "built for servants to move unseen, passages behind walls, chutes for coal and laundry, a secret world beneath the floors." A flicker of hope, so faint it was almost painful, ignited in the darkness of his mind. A coal chute, an exit, not for people, but for fuel. It was a chance. A desperate, slim, almost impossible chance. But it was more than nothing. He remembered another passage, one he had barely registered at the time, a mention of the old groundskeeper who lived in a small cottage at the edge of the woods, a man named Samuel. "Old Samuel brought me a flower once, before," Isabella had written. "He tucked it into the woodpile. He has kind eyes. I wonder if he remembers me. I wonder if he knows I am still here, right beneath his feet." The groundskeeper's cottage. He had seen it. On that first, desperate night when they had approached the mansion, he had seen a single, warm light flickering in the distance. A small cottage nestled against the dark line of the trees. A tiny beacon of life on the edge of the vast, dead estate. If they could get out, that was their destination. Samuel, the man with the kind eyes, a man who remembered Isabella before she became a ghost. He was their only hope for a witness, their only port in this sudden, violent storm. The plan formed in his mind, forged in equal parts desperation and memory. He had to act now. The air was already noticeably thinner, and a dull, throbbing ache was beginning to form behind his temples. "Maya," he said, his voice urgent but controlled, "listen to me. We are going on an adventure, back into the tunnel. It's very important that you stay right with me and do exactly as I say. Can you do that?" Her small face was pale in the gloom, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded bravely. "Are we going to find the food ghost, Daddy?" she asked, her voice a tiny thread of sound. "Yes, sweetie," he said, his throat tightening. "We're going to find out who the ghost is once and for all." He scooped her up into his arms, her small body trembling. He grabbed the diary, tucking it securely inside his jacket. The book was a weapon now, and he would die before he let it go. His eyes darted to the section of the wall where the heavy stone block concealed the entrance to the secret room, their escape route, their only way out. Working with frantic, desperate speed, he used the rebar to pry the heavy stone block away from the wall once more. The scrape of stone on concrete sounded deafeningly loud in the suffocating stillness. He couldn't afford to be quiet. Time was a luxury they no longer had. A wave of dizziness washed over him as he strained, a clear and terrifying sign that the oxygen in the room was depleting rapidly. Black spots danced in his vision. He pushed harder, a low groan escaping his lips, his muscles screaming in protest. The block finally tilted and fell, revealing the dark, square opening. He didn't hesitate. "Hold on tight," he whispered to Maya, and then he plunged into the opening, pulling his daughter in behind him, leaving the silent, waiting tomb of the main basement behind them. The air in the hidden room was just as stale, but at least it felt like a separate pocket, a small reprieve. He grabbed the heavy iron strongbox, the blood money, the ultimate proof of the Correa family's crimes. It was impossibly heavy, but he looped his arm through the handle, his muscles straining. He would not leave it behind. He squeezed back into the narrow service tunnel, this time with Maya clinging to his back and the heavy box banging against his legs. The darkness was absolute, a thick, smothering blanket. Maya whimpered, her face buried in his shoulder. "It's okay, I've got you," he whispered, his own voice tight with fear. He shuffled forward, one hand on the wall to guide him, the other steadying Maya. The tunnel felt even more claustrophobic this time, the walls seeming to press in, the silence screaming in his ears. He focused on Isabella's words, her mental map guiding him through the blackness. She had written of a fork in the tunnel, an offshoot that led not to the dumbwaiter, but deeper into the foundations, toward the old furnace room. He felt for it with his free hand, his fingers tracing the cold, rough brick, his heart hammered against his ribs. What if he had misremembered? What if the tunnel was a dead end? The thought was a new spike of terror. They would be trapped in the guts of the house, buried alive in the dark. Then his fingers found it. A void, an opening on his left. The tunnel branched off, just as she had written. A wave of profound relief, so intense it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He turned into the new passage. The air here was different. It smelled of coal dust and soot, a dry, acrid scent that was a welcome change from the stagnant air of the basement. He was on the right path. This tunnel felt older, the brickwork cruder. He could hear the faint scuttling of rats, disturbed by his presence. He moved faster now, his hope renewed. The heavy strongbox a dead weight, but also a symbol of the justice he was fighting for. He could feel Maya's breathing against his neck, quick and shallow. He had to get her out. He had to get her into the fresh air. The image of the groundskeeper's cottage, its single warm light, burned in his mind, a distant star to navigate by in this subterranean night. He pushed onward, his body screaming with effort. Driven by pure paternal instinct, the tunnel ended abruptly, not with a door, but with a solid wall of crumbling brick and mortar. Liam's heart sank, a dead end. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed at his gut. Had he been wrong? Was this it? He ran his hands over the surface in a frenzy. It felt rough, uneven, and then he felt it, a circular metal frame buried beneath a thin layer of plaster and bricks. The coal chute. It had been sealed up, bricked over from the inside. Magnus Correa, he realized, had been thorough. He had sealed his daughter's tomb from every possible angle, ensuring there was no escape. A surge of white-hot fury gave Liam a fresh burst of strength. He would not be beaten by this man's ghost. He would not let this wall be the end of their story. He still had the rebar, which he'd dragged with him. It was their only tool, their only hope. "Hold on, Maya," he grunted, shifting her weight. He wedged the tip of the rebar into a crack in the mortar and began to hammer at it with the iron strongbox. The clang of metal on metal was a desperate, rhythmic prayer in the suffocating darkness. The sound was followed by the satisfying crumble of old mortar. Dust filled the air, making him cough, his lungs burning from the exertion and the lack of oxygen. He worked with a madman's energy, driven by the image of Maya's face, the thought of her struggling for breath. He attacked the wall. Piece by piece, brick by brick, a single brick came loose. He tore it out with his bare hands, his fingers raw and bleeding. A tiny pinprick of night air, cold and sweet, touched his face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. Hope, real and powerful, surged through him. He attacked the wall with renewed vigor, the hole growing larger with every frantic blow. The sounds were a symphony of desperation, his own ragged, gasping breaths, the high-pitched clang of the rebar, the low thud of dislodged bricks hitting the floor. Maya's soft, frightened whimpers. His body was a machine, fueled by adrenaline and love. His shoulders ached, his lungs burned, his hands were torn and bloody, but he didn't feel the pain. All he felt was the primal, urgent need to get his daughter out into the open air. He tore at the opening, making it wider, faster, pulling away the crumbling chunks of brick and plaster. The hole was now big enough to see through. He saw a patch of starry night sky, the dark silhouettes of bare, skeletal trees. Freedom was inches away. "Almost there, baby girl," he gasped, his voice raw. "Almost there." He gave one final, mighty heave, and a large section of the old brickwork collapsed inward, revealing an opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. He pushed the strongbox and the rebar out first, the metal scraping on the ground outside. Then, holding Maya tight, he scrambled through the hole, his clothes snagging on the rough edges of the broken bricks. They tumbled out onto a pile of damp, decaying leaves, landing hard on the cold, wet ground. The air hit him like a physical blow. It was freezing, sharp, and achingly, gloriously fresh. He fell to his knees, gasping, pulling in huge, shuddering lungfuls of the cold night air, his lungs burning with the sudden shock of it. He held Maya close, listening to her cough and then take her own deep, desperate breaths. They were out. They were free. The stars shone with an impossible brightness in the black, moonless sky. He looked back at the dark, hulking mass of the mansion, a monstrous beast against the skyline, its windows like dead, vacant eyes. They had escaped its belly. They had survived. A wave of trembling racked his body, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-rattling chill and a universe of pain in his hands and shoulders. But there was no time to rest. Alistair would know something was wrong. The camera in the service tunnel would show the hidden room was empty. He had no idea how long it would take for Alistair to check, but they couldn't be here when he did. He staggered to his feet, pulling Maya up with him. He grabbed the strongbox and the diary. He scanned the darkness, his eyes searching for the light, the cottage. There it was, a tiny, warm yellow square in the distance, partially obscured by the twisted, skeletal branches of the overgrown orchard. It looked a mile away. His legs felt like lead. His body screamed in protest, but he knew they had to run. Their survival depended on reaching that light. "We have to run now, sweetie," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He scooped her up again, her small frame feeling impossibly heavy. Cradling his daughter with one arm, clutching the heavy iron box and the precious diary with the other, he began to run. He stumbled through the overgrown grounds of the estate, his feet catching on unseen roots and tangled vines. The freezing air burned his raw throat, and every jarring step sent a shock of pain through his exhausted body. The only sounds were his own ragged gasps for air, the frantic pounding of his feet on the frozen earth, and the soft whisper of the wind through the bare trees. He felt like a fugitive, hunted and exposed under the vast, indifferent sky. The mansion loomed behind them, a silent, dark predator, and he felt its unseen eyes on his back, urging him faster. The cottage grew closer, the light a warm, welcoming beacon in the hostile darkness. He could see the faint outline of a porch, a wisp of smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was a picture of peace and warmth, a world away from the cold stone tomb they had just escaped. The hope that it represented gave him a final burst of energy. He pushed himself harder, his legs pumping, his lungs on fire. He ran not just from Alistair, but from the ghost of Magnus Correa, from the legacy of pain and suffering that had soaked into the very soil of this place. He ran towards the one person who might still remember the truth, the one person who could give a name to Isabella's ghost and a voice to her stolen story. The distance closed. 50 yards. 30. 10. He burst out of the line of trees and stumbled across a small, clear lawn, his feet sinking into the soft, cold grass. He reached the front door of the cottage, a simple, weathered wooden door with a small, brass handle. He was sobbing now, great, ragged, tearless sobs of exhaustion, fear, and relief. He didn't even have the strength to knock properly. He half collapsed against the door, his shoulder hitting it with a dull thud, the iron strongbox clattering loudly onto the wooden porch. He pounded his free fist against the wood, a weak, frantic rhythm. "Please," he gasped, his voice a broken wreck. "Please, help us." He could hear movement inside, the sound of a chair scraping back, then slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door. A bolt was drawn, a sound that made him flinch, and the door creaked open a few inches. An old man's face, etched with the deep lines of a long and difficult life, peered out at them. His eyes, blue and faded, but startlingly sharp, were filled with caution and suspicion. The man, frail and stooped, stared at Liam, at the terrified, shivering child in his arms, at his torn and bloody hands, at the strange iron box on the porch. "What is this?" the old man asked, his voice a dry, reedy rasp, like the rustle of autumn leaves. "Who are you?" Liam couldn't form a complete sentence. He was beyond words, his body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He held up the diary, its dark leather cover seeming to absorb the faint light from the cottage. "Correa," Liam choked out, the name itself a plea. "Isabella. Correa." The old man's sharp eyes widened. The suspicion vanished, replaced by a look of profound, dawning horror, a recognition that transcended the 50 years that had passed. His gaze dropped to the diary in Liam's hand, and a name escaped his lips, a ghostly whisper on the cold night air. Isabella. He knew. He remembered. Liam had found him. He had found Samuel. Samuel's face, already a roadmap of wrinkles, seemed to collapse inward, the skin paling to a ghostly white. The caution in his eyes was washed away by a tidal wave of ancient grief and a fear that was shockingly immediate. He looked from Liam's desperate face to the diary, then back again, his mind clearly racing across a chasm of 50 years in a single, heart-stopping instant. "You were in the house," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying understanding. "You were in the basement." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of horrified fact. He reached out a frail, gnarled hand, not to help, but to touch the cover of the diary, his fingers hovering over the worn leather as if touching a sacred relic or a venomous snake. The name Isabella had been a key, unlocking a part of his memory that had been sealed away for half a century, a secret he had carried like a stone in his soul. Liam knew in that moment he had not just found an ally, he had found the story's first and last witness. With a strength that belied his age, Samuel pulled them inside, quickly shutting and bolting the door behind them. The room was small and Spartan, but radiated an incredible warmth from a crackling fire in a stone hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and brewing tea. It was the scent of safety, of sanctuary. Maya, exhausted and overwhelmed, finally let go, her body going limp as she fell into a deep, sudden sleep in Liam's arms. Samuel led them to a worn armchair by the fire, and Liam sank into it, his muscles finally giving out. He gently laid Maya down on a nearby rag rug, pulling a thick, hand-knitted afghan over her. Samuel moved with a quiet, urgent purpose, his earlier frailty replaced by a galvanized energy. He returned with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, and began to gently clean the blood and grime from Liam's torn hands. His touch was surprisingly steady. "I helped build her prison," Samuel said, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. He didn't look at Liam, his eyes fixed on the task of cleaning the wounds. I didn't know, not really. I was just a boy, barely 17, Magnus Correa. He was like a god on this land. When he told you to do something, you did it. He paid me extra to brick up the old coal chute, said it was for security, to keep vagrants out. He paused, his hands stilling for a moment. But I saw her once, before, a few weeks before I sealed the wall. I saw her face in the window of her upstairs bedroom. She looked so sad. Then, she was just gone. The family said she'd been sent away to a special school in Europe. But the staff, we whispered. We knew something was wrong. But to speak against Magnus, it was suicide. He had provided the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. He wasn't just a witness to rumors. He was an unwitting, unwilling accomplice. Liam felt a wave of empathy for the old man, a shared burden of guilt and sorrow across the generations. Samuel's secret had been a poison he'd lived with for 50 years, just as the Correa fortune had been a poison on the land. He looked at his sleeping daughter, her chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm by the fire's warmth, and he knew he had made the right choice. He had risked everything, not just for the memory of Isabella, but for Maya's future, to ensure she would never have to live in a world where men like Magnus and Alistair Correa could operate with impunity. The heavy iron box sat on the floorboards, a dark, squat toad of a thing, radiating a cold promise of both justice and danger. The chase was over, for now. The escape was complete. But the fight, the real fight, was just about to begin, here in this small, warm cottage, with an old man haunted by his past and a young man determined to build a future. Samuel finished tending to Liam's hands, wrapping them in clean strips of cloth. He finally met Liam's eyes, and in their faded blue depths, Liam saw not just guilt, but a flicker of the same hard, cold resolve that he felt in his own heart. The boy who had been too scared to speak up 50 years ago was gone, replaced by an old man with nothing left to lose and a conscience to clear. "Alistair is his grandfather's son in every way," Samuel said, his voice now firm, all trace of readiness gone. "He's a snake, but a smart one. He'll be looking for you. He'll have men. We don't have much time." He stood up and walked over to an old rotary dial telephone on a small wooden table. His hand, gnarled with arthritis, hovered over the dial. But Magnus Correa made enemies, powerful ones. One of them became a lawyer, a very famous, very dangerous lawyer who has been waiting 50 years for a chance to tear down everything Magnus built. I think it's time we made that call. The smell of dust and decay that had clung to Liam began to fade, replaced by the scent of wood smoke and a faint, sharp smell of antiseptic from his bandaged hands. He watched Samuel, this unexpected, crucial ally, and felt the weight of the night begin to shift. He was no longer a lone victim running for his life. He was a witness, armed with the unassailable proof of the diary and the money, and he now had a guide, a guardian of the story who knew which doors to knock on. The firelight danced across Maya's sleeping face, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a genuine, unforced sense of hope began to dawn in Liam's exhausted mind. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but it was a path that led toward the light. The point of no return had been passed not when Alistair sealed the door, but now, with Samuel's hand on the telephone, preparing to bring the full weight of the past crashing down upon the present. The cozy warmth of the small cottage felt like a dream after the eternal, soul-crushing cold of the basement. Liam felt a deep, shuddering exhaustion settle into his bones, a weariness that went far beyond the physical. He had been hollowed out by fear and despair, and now, in this small pocket of safety, the sheer emotional toll of the past weeks began to crash down on him. He watched the flames in the hearth dance and flicker, their light casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. It was a hypnotic, calming sight. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt a fragile, tentative sense of peace. He had done it. He had protected his child. He had taken on the monster in the dark, and for now, he had won. The path forward was terrifying, but he would not walk it alone. The weight of the iron strongbox felt different now, not just a burden of a dark past, but the currency of a just future. Samuel's presence was a quiet, solid anchor in the storm of Liam's thoughts. The old man moved with a slow, deliberate grace, making them tea, his movements practiced and comforting. There was a silent understanding between them, the bond of two men from different generations united by a single, terrible story. Samuel's knowledge of the past and Liam's experience in the present formed a bridge across time, connecting Magnus's original crime to Alistair's immediate threat. Liam realized that Alistair's greatest mistake was not underestimating him, but in assuming that all the ghosts of his family's past were truly dead and buried. Some ghosts, it turned out, were just waiting for someone to open the door, and Samuel had been waiting by that door for 50 years. The quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room was the only sound, counting down the final moments of the Correa dynasty. Liam looked down at his bandaged hands. They were the hands of a builder, a man who created things, who brought order from chaos. For weeks, they had been useless, trembling with cold and helplessness. But tonight, they had become tools of liberation. They had pried open a secret, broken down a wall, and carried his daughter to safety. The pain throbbing in them was a welcome, grounding sensation, a physical testament to his fight. He had been reduced to nothing, a ghost haunting a basement, but in confronting the darkness, he had found a strength he never knew he possessed. He had been fighting for his daughter's survival, but in doing so, he had also begun to reclaim his own soul from the abyss of grief and failure. The fight was far from over, but he was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was an agent of justice, a man who held a family's dark history in his wounded hands. As Samuel began to slowly dial the number on the old phone, each turn of the rotary wheel a deliberate, mechanical click, Liam felt the turning point lock into place. This was the moment of escalation, the declaration of war. Up until now, it had been a personal struggle for survival. Now, it was becoming something much larger. He was no longer just fighting for himself and Maya. He was fighting for Isabella, for the farmers whose land was stolen, for every person the Correa family had crushed on their ascent to power. He was a fulcrum, a single point upon which the weight of history was now balanced. The ringing of the phone on the other end of the line, a faint, tinny sound from the earpiece, sounded to Liam like a summons, a bell tolling for a long-delayed reckoning. He took a deep breath, the warm, smoky air filling his lungs, and prepared himself for the battle to come. The climax of his escape was over, but the climax of the story had just begun. Samuel's trembling finger spun the rotary dial, each click a stone dropping into a 50-year-old well of silence. The call connected, and a sharp, incisive voice cut through the line. Samuel didn't plead. He stated facts. Correa, the estate. I have proof. On the other end, the lawyer, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had dedicated her life to dismantling corporate predators, felt a jolt of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in years. This was the case her father, one of Magnus's first victims, had spoken of on his deathbed, a ghost story, and now the ghost had a witness. Liam sat by the fire, holding his sleeping daughter, listening to the one-sided conversation that was rewriting their future. The air in the cottage crackled not just with fire, but with the electric potential of long-delayed vengeance. The first domino had been pushed, and it was aimed squarely at the heart of the Correa Empire, a force of nature about to be unleashed by a single, quiet phone call in the dead of the night. The hunted had become the hunters. The next morning, they were not in a cottage but in a high-rise office of polished steel and glass, a place that smelled of success and expensive coffee. Eleanor Vance was a force of nature, her presence filling the room with an intimidating intelligence. The evidence was laid out on a vast mahogany desk, a stark tableau of history's crimes, Isabella's diary, its pages brittle and sacred, the original deeds, their ink faded but their truth undeniable, and the iron strongbox, open, spilling its hoard of 1970s currency, the seed money of a criminal dynasty. Liam, cleaned up and dressed in clothes provided by Eleanor's assistant, recounted the story. His voice, once tight with fear, was now steady and clear. He spoke of the cold, the hunger, the terror, and the discovery. Eleanor listened without interruption, her sharp eyes moving from Liam's face to the diary, her expression a mask of cold, controlled fury. She was not just hearing a story, She was receiving the weapon she had waited her entire life to wield against the Correa name. Eleanor Vance made only 2 calls. The first was to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The second to the lead of a federal white-collar crime task force she had worked with before. Within an hour, the mahogany desk was the center of a tense, impromptu war room. Stern-faced men and women in dark suits, their expressions grim, listened as Eleanor laid out the case. They handled the diary with archival gloves. The pages a sacred text of a corporate founding myth, built on lies and murder. The serial numbers on the old currency were cross-referenced against treasury records from the era, a painstaking process that began immediately. An agent, his voice low, read a passage from the diary aloud, Isabella's words filling the sterile office with a palpable sorrow and rage. There was no doubt, no hesitation. The case was airtight. A federal judge was woken for an emergency warrant, and as the sun rose over the city, a convoy of black and unmarked vehicles moved out, their purpose clear and final, to cut the head off the snake. Alistair Correa was in his element. He stood at the head of a glass boardroom table on the top floor of the Correa Tower, a king surveying his kingdom of glass and steel below. He was commanding, charming, and utterly in control, negotiating a multi-billion-dollar merger. He had already dismissed the basement incident as a minor loose end, 2 insignificant lives that had been neatly and quietly tidied away. The sudden, violent entry of a dozen federal agents, clad in tactical vests with FBI emblazoned in bold yellow letters, was therefore an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of his perfectly ordered reality. The sharp command, Alistair Correa, "You are under arrest," seemed to echo from another world. The gasps of his board members were a distant sound. All he could feel was the cold, brutal finality of the steel handcuffs as they were snapped onto his wrists. The sound, a sharp, metallic click, was the echo of a basement door being bolted shut. The sound of a legacy of crime finally, irrevocably, being brought to justice. The arrest sent shockwaves through the financial world, but it was the story behind it that captured the nation's heart. "The basement ghost of Correa Tower," screamed one headline. "Dynasty built on blood money," declared another. Eleanor Vance, with surgical precision, released key excerpts from Isabella's diary to a trusted journalist. Suddenly, Isabella was no longer a forgotten secret. She was a martyr. Her portrait, a small, black and white photo found with the diary, was everywhere, a beautiful, sad-eyed girl who became the face of corporate greed's human cost. Liam, shielded from the media circus by Eleanor, was painted as an avenging angel, the unwilling hero who had stumbled into a 50-year-old crime scene and refused to look away. The narrative was perfect. A modern-day fable of David and Goliath. The Correa Corporation's stock plummeted, its pristine public image shattered beyond repair, all because of a story written in faded ink by a girl in a cold, dark room a lifetime ago. The legal battle was less a battle and more of an avalanche. Armed with the diary, Samuel's corroborating testimony, and the meticulously documented financial trail leading from the strongbox to the corporation's founding, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Alistair's attempted murder charge was just the beginning. The federal government launched a massive RICO investigation into the Correa Corporation, peeling back layers of fraud, blackmail, and corruption that stretched back 50 years. Descendants of the families Magnus had ruined, whose stories had been dismissed as bitter folklore, came forward, their old claims suddenly validated by the recovered deeds. Class action lawsuits piled up, each one a nail in the coffin of the Correa Empire. Alistair, stripped of his power and wealth, could only watch from a prison cell as the entire edifice his grandfather had built on a foundation of bone and sorrow was systematically and completely dismantled, brick by stolen brick, until nothing was left but the dust of its own dark history. In the quiet aftermath, long after the headlines had faded, came the final accounting. For his role as the key witness, and as a form of restorative justice for the horrors he and Maya had endured, the court-appointed trustees overseeing the liquidation of Correa's assets awarded Liam a settlement. When Eleanor Vance told him the number, he didn't understand it. The figure was astronomical, a string of zeros that seemed more like a line of code than a sum of money. It wasn't just the contents of the strongbox, but a substantial portion of the recovered assets tied to the original land fraud. "It's not a reward, Liam," Eleanor told him, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "It's a debt. The Correa family had a debt to this world, to Isabella, to those farmers. You just collected it on their behalf." He looked at the check, at the impossible number, and saw not wealth, but a future. He saw safety. He saw a world where Maya would never ever be cold or hungry again. It was the price of a ghost's freedom. 2 years later, the only basement Liam entered was his own, and it was warm, dry, and filled with neatly organized storage bins. He hadn't bought a mansion. He'd bought a life. Their new home was a comfortable 2-story house on a quiet suburban street, with a sprawling green lawn and a massive oak tree perfect for a swing. The air didn't smell of mold and despair. It smelled of fresh-cut grass in the summer and cinnamon from the kitchen in the winter. Instead of huddling for warmth under a single threadbare blanket on a concrete floor, Maya now had a bright pink bedroom filled with stuffed animals, her laughter echoing through the halls. Liam would often just stop what he was doing and watch her playing in the sun-drenched living room, her face full of the easy, uncomplicated joy of a child who feels completely and utterly safe. The gnawing emptiness in his chest, the constant companion of his grief and poverty, had been filled. It was filled with light, with warmth, and with the sound of his daughter's happy, carefree voice. In the garage, which he had converted into a bright, spacious workshop, Liam found his purpose again. The scent of sawdust had replaced the scent of decay. His hands, no longer torn or trembling, were steady and sure. He had a full set of professional-grade tools, their polished steel gleaming in the afternoon light. He wasn't framing houses for strangers. He was creating worlds for his daughter. Today, he was putting the finishing touches on a magnificent handcrafted dollhouse, a perfect miniature replica of their new home. He carefully glued a tiny wooden bird, a replica of Isabella's carving, onto the peak of the roof. The original, dark and petrified with age, sat on a place of honor on his workbench, a silent, watchful guardian over his new life. It was a constant reminder of where they had come from, a memento of the ghost who had, in her own tragic way, saved them. He picked it up, its worn wood smooth against his palm, a tangible link to the past that had made his peaceful present possible, a promise he had helped keep. The scene is a simple dinner. The table is laden with roasted chicken, steaming vegetables, and a loaf of fresh, crusty bread. The sounds are of Maya's excited chatter about her day at school, the clink of silverware on ceramic plates, and the warm, rumbling laughter of old Samuel, who had become a fixture in their lives, a grandfather to Maya and a dear friend to Liam. There is no fear, no rationing, no mysterious benefactor. The food is a celebration of family, of life, of a hard-won peace. Liam looks across the table at his smiling daughter and his trusted friend, and a profound sense of gratitude washes over him, so powerful it almost brings tears to his eyes. This warmth, this laughter, this simple, ordinary moment. This was the true treasure. Liam's story is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest, coldest darkness, the fight for family and justice can bring you into the light. If you are moved by his journey from despair to redemption, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another story that truly matters.